Let's look at the laws to begin with. How much of a threat are they to democracy and to that movement in Hong Kong?
It's really a major blow both to the democracy movement in Hong Kong and to the wider community of people in Hong Kong and businesses too, for two key reasons. One is the proposals themselves, which would make things like subversion, separatism, foreign interference illegal. But as we know from mainland China, these are catch-all offences often used to prosecute and persecute legitimate government critics. The other important thing to understand is the way this is being implemented. So the Chinese authorities are effectively bringing in this legislation by diktat from Beijing rather than letting Hong Kong legislate for itself, which implies not just a threat to the freedoms of Hong Kong, but also to the autonomy that the city has long enjoyed. And in fact, that autonomy is the basis for the city's prosperity as a global financial centre.
So basically it's a threat to that one nation, two systems approach, which was agreed on decades ago.
Exactly. The one country, two systems, as it was known, was the foundation for Hong Kong's rejoining the People's Republic of China in 1997. It was meant to guarantee, in fact, according to the mini constitution of Hong Kong, it guarantees freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, etc. And I think it's hard to imagine those freedoms, which have already been under great pressure in the last 5 years, sustaining into the future, given the way the Chinese Communist Party treats critics in the mainland. So I think it is really a dismantling of that system and a reframing of it in a way that's much more beneficial to the Communist Party. And that's obviously bad for the democracy movement. I think it's bad for business in Hong Kong, and it's bad for Australia and other countries that use Hong Kong as a major base for their business around the world.
And Ben Bland, how much is it the fact that China, or the Chinese communist regime, is much more powerful today than when it was when that arrangement was struck with the UK?
I think that's certainly true to an extent. I mean, it was a very different China back in 1997, a much smaller economy, a much smaller footprint beyond its own borders. So I think there's definitely a sense of realpolitik there. But there's a paradox at the heart of this. On the one hand, you're right that China is acting because it feels strong. It feels it can get away with pushing Hong Kongers around and risking threats and negative comments from other governments around the world. On the other hand, the fact that a nation of 1.4 billion people, at least the government of that nation, is so concerned about a few democracy activists in a city of 7 million people shows a certain bristleness and weakness at the heart of the Chinese Communist Party. So it's quite a paradoxical situation.
And I guess if you've got a country of 1.4 billion alongside a thriving democracy where the citizens are allowed to vote and a free media and all that sort of thing, that it's almost a risk, isn't it, to the rest of the governance of that country, because people will be looking across to Hong Kong and thinking, well, where's our freedom?
I think that's one concern. I think more generally, Hong Kong, if it were to have thrived as a democracy, it would undermine the legitimacy of the Communist Party of China. Beijing is saying to its own people, we need this one-party authoritarian system to maintain order, to ensure economic success, to ensure that China is respected in the world. And if you have a counterexample of the exact opposite system, a kind of Western liberal democracy thriving in one of your cities, it really undermines those claims. So I think it was very hard to see how Hong Kong could survive in the long term as a democracy, so long as the Chinese Communist Party is growing in its own power. So I think we're seeing kind of the unwinding of the tensions that were implicit in one country, two systems. They were there at the start, but the power dynamics now today are very different. And that's why we're seeing an escalation, in fact, in the unwinding of the one country, two systems arrangement.
The democracy movement it's been quite dramatic, the impact it's had. And as you've indicated, it's rattled the authorities in Beijing. What does the future hold for that democratic movement in Hong Kong?
It's clearly a really, really difficult time. We already know that during last year's unprecedented protests, there were thousands of Hong Kongers arrested. I think more than 1,000 have been charged already and they're going on trial. In a city of 7 million people, that's a significant number of people who are effectively going to become political prisoners. I think if we look at the pattern of Beijing's repression in Hong Kong over the last decade, we can see that it's succeeded to a certain extent in gaining some control over Hong Kong society. But on the other hand, they've always created this huge backlash. And at the moment, I think the democracy movement, in a sense, is more united, it's more determined than it has been in a long time. So it seems as if the stage is set for a deepening conflict, with Beijing intensifying its crackdown, but at the same time, the democracy movement hardening, and certainly some, particularly young people within the movement, becoming ever more radical in the tactics they're willing to advance, and the police too becoming more and more violent and proactive in the way they're trying to crack down on the democracy movement. So it looks as if the spiral into conflict in Hong Kong is sadly going to continue.
Ben Bland from the Lowy Institute, thanks so much for your analysis. Appreciate it.